Welcome to EdLeader with your host, Dr. Rob Jackson. Join Dr. Jackson for conversations and reflections on improving educational leadership from the classroom to the boardroom and beyond. Educational leadership is an ever-evolving opportunity to make a real and lasting difference in the lives of students, parents, and the community. And now, here's your host, Dr. Rob Jackson.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the EdLeader podcast. I'm your host, Rob Jackson, and I want to thank you for spending time with me today. One of the things I love about the podcast is the variety of ed leaders I get to speak with each week. From practitioners to authors to researchers, each one is contributing to our work as a profession, and we are collectively stronger for it. Speaking of growing stronger, today's guest is helping us do just that. Let's get to it. Our guest today is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Leadership, Policy, and Human Development in the College of Education at North Carolina State University. She holds a PhD in Education Policy from the University of Arkansas, a master's in Elementary Education from the University of Notre Dame, and a bachelor's in Elementary Education and History from St. Patrick's College in Dublin, Ireland, where she grew up. She completed her postdoctoral fellowship in the Program of Education, Policy, and Governance at Harvard University. In the fall of 2017, she served as a visiting assistant professor of public policy at Duke University. Her research focuses on evaluation of education policies and programs intended to close racial and economic achievement gaps. Her studies have examined school choice policy, school size, the influence of family background on intergenerational economic mobility, and the diversification of the teacher labor force. In 2015, she was the recipient of the University of Notre Dame's Michael Presley Award for a promising scholar in the education field, and in 2017, the College of Education and Health Professions at the University of Arkansas awarded her the Outstanding Young Alumni Award. She has served as the principal investigator or co-principal investigator on grants totaling over $6 million. Her scholarly articles have appeared in the journals Economics of Education Review, Education Finance and Policy, and Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis. Her research has been featured in a number of mainstream media outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Politico, and The Atlantic. Most recently, she helped co-author the just-released Wallace Foundation Report, How Principles Affect Students and Schools, a systematic synthesis of 2 decades of research that found in part that an effective principle's impact is stronger and broader than previously thought, making it difficult to envision a higher return on investment in K-12 education than the cultivation of high-quality school leadership, according to the research just released. A copy of that research can be found linked in the show notes for today's episode at drrobjackson.com. Our guest today, for the second straight year, has been ranked among Education Week's top 200 scholars who had the biggest influence on educational practice and policy in 2020. Please give a very special welcome to today's guest, Dr. Anna Egalite.
Dr. Egalite, I am so excited to have an opportunity to sit down with you. I feel like I'm in the presence of greatness. When I read the press release that you had once again been ranked as one of the top 200 scholars who had the biggest influence on educational practice and policy, and knowing that you're a scholar right here in my home state of North Carolina, I just was incredibly excited. Thank you for being with me this morning.
Oh, thank you for having me on the podcast. It's exciting to be here.
Absolutely. Well, as I've gotten to know you, I've just been blown away by your background, by your commitment to helping ed leaders and educators grow in their work. And so this ranking really is kind of indicative of not just the quality of work you're doing, but the influence of the work you're doing. Share with us about this rank that you've now received 2 years in a row.
Yeah, so it's called the Edu-Scholar rankings, and they weight things that aren't always necessarily rewarded in academia. So in the tenure track, we get rewarded for publishing and for bringing in grants primarily. And in the real world, if you want to change policy or practice, then you have to do a little bit more legwork in terms of translating your work. So writing op-eds or blog posts, doing interviews with journalists, even if it's just on background to bring them up to speed on an area that you might be an expert in. Those are efforts that many in the field wanted to see better rewarded. And so that's why the Edu-Scholar rankings exist, is to count things like taking the time for writing books and speaking to a lay audience. So it was exciting to be included on the list, but it's a lot of pressure now. I got to climb higher. I got to maintain my spot. So we'll see what the future holds.
Well, look, after 2 years in a row, we're expecting a three-peat, But Dr. Egalite, your background in terms of your preparation for the work you're doing now is just absolutely remarkable. But I am sure our listeners just picked up on something, and that is your beautiful accent. Tell us about where that accent comes from, because it's incredibly exciting to me.
Oh, thank you. So yes, I was born and raised in Waterford, Ireland. So it's in the sunny southeast, about 2.5 hours south of the capital, Dublin. And I lived there until my 20s, and then I enrolled in a master's program through the University of Notre Dame. And it's an AmeriCorps program. It's teaching, service through teaching is the motto. And it's called the Alliance for Catholic Education through the University of Notre Dame. So that was my transition to the United States, was to pursue that master's degree. And while I was there, I met my husband. We fell in love, and here I am still living in the United States. I actually just became a U.S. citizen a few months ago. So it's very exciting.
Congratulations. Congratulations. I absolutely love that. And I noticed that your bachelor's degree from St. Patrick's College in Dublin is actually in elementary education. Did you initially think that you would spend time as a teacher?
Yes, I did. So when I graduated from my bachelor's program, I moved home and I taught in a school in my hometown, an all boys school. And I taught for 4 years, so 2 years in my hometown and then 2 years in Florida through the Alliance for Catholic Education. And so over that time period, it was always the elementary grades. I had first grade, fourth grade, fifth grade. And then at one point when I was still doing they call it teaching practice, but training to be a teacher, I had kindergarten for an extended period of about a month. And so that was, I think, probably where I felt like my hair was catching on fire. That was the most challenging of all those experiences. It certainly was a unique age group to work with, but I really loved that middle grades age, like fourth and fifth grade was a sweet spot for me.
I absolutely know what you're talking about. In my background, I was an elementary teacher as well and taught fourth grade. And so that was my love. But as one of the few male teachers at the elementary level, and others may relate to this, typically the principal would place in my classroom a large number of boys because boys tend to be quite active and sometimes boisterous. And you just mentioned teaching in an all-boys school. So I can imagine how exciting that was on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's just common in Ireland. It's a different system, but they generally separate the boys and the girls all the way through the primary and the secondary ages. So it creates for a different environment. I think when I moved to Florida and I had boys and girls in the same classroom, I thought, oh yeah, this is different. They mellowed each other out a little bit, I think.
So since we have the opportunity to kind of dig into that for a second, share with me your perceptions on the difference between having all boys in one school or a mixture of boys and girls in the same school in terms of those two different systems. You've taught in both now. What do you prefer? What were your takeaways from that?
Yeah, there's definitely strengths and weaknesses to having that system. I think the teaching workforce has been primarily female for a long time in both countries, both in the United States and in Ireland. And like you said, you were one of the few male teachers. It is a topic I'm really interested in, is increasing teacher diversity, not just gender, but also race of the teachers. And that's a whole research arm that I've been fascinated with for a long time, because I think the composition of your school, your classmates, that's one element that's really interesting, but also the composition of the teacher workforce and the leadership in the school. I think there's some really interesting and exciting research coming out about how that changes the environment. It changes the expectations that teachers and principals might have for the students of color in the school. And, people think of Ireland when I talk about these things and they think, oh, but isn't Ireland, a very white country and sort of have these outdated notions, whereas we have had so much immigration in recent years that it's really quite a diverse country now, both in terms of nationalities represented and race and ethnicity in the schools. So a lot of the same experiences that are very familiar in the United States, we're catching up to and having to navigate through that. And I think it's been fun to have a foot in both worlds and see, well, what can we learn from one and teach the other? And in the United States, something I think that's been really helpful has been this push and this drive towards increasing diversity among the educators.
Absolutely. And, it's not just, and I appreciate you mentioning it as a research interest. It's also, I would think, a compelling need, certainly in education, for us to have teachers that look like our students so that our students can look to the front of the classroom and say, there's somebody who looks like me being very successful, being respected, et cetera. And the work that you do in terms of the research, but then kind of circling back to this ranking and what you mentioned earlier in terms of research is great, but if it's just sitting on a shelf someplace, if it's just in some digital file someplace, it's not moving the needle. But when it actually has an impact on public policy, that's got to be the exciting part of the work. You are at NC State, a school that I hold in high regard. My oldest son graduated from NC State with his undergraduate degree, and so go Wolfpack. We certainly appreciate that. But you've had the opportunity to work with just incredibly highly regarded schools, some postdoc work at Harvard, spent some time at Duke University, your PhD from the from Arkansas, you mentioned earlier, working at Notre Dame. All of that work just has to be part of the reason that you've received this acknowledgement. But then as I consider that and then look at this report that's just been released by the Wallace Foundation that I'm really excited about and can't wait to dive into with you, the work around principles, knowing that you did some of that work with other colleagues from Vanderbilt and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Share with our listeners who may not be as familiar with the work of educational researchers, just how closely educational researchers work together across universities or throughout the field.
Yeah, so the foundation is a really great way to build connections and build community in our field, because our work on this synthesis, so it's a knowledge synthesis of the past 2 decades of research on school principals, and we're trying to summarize it for the average reader to really make sense of what have been some very complex studies, but bringing it all together into a very readable format. That was one of 3 projects that they funded at the same time. And so it was very important for the foundation to build community among the researchers. And so we had these cross-team calls every month. We were like the Brady Bunch on Zoom. We could see everybody. And so that was one way to build networks with other researchers who are interested in these topics. And so for future projects, it makes it much easier to reach out and build those collaborations. Another way in academia that we find partners to do this type of work with is through our professional conferences. So AEFP is the Association for Education, Finance and Policy. That's a wonderful organization that meets annually. And they do a lot of work with mentoring the youngest students or the graduate students who have not yet attained their PhD, but are starting to do this type of research. So AEFP, another is APAM, the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management. And those 2 meetings are great. I'm also on the planning committee, so I have to give a shout out for another conference called the ISCRC, the International School Choice and Reform Conference. And so that conference welcomes all types of research, both in favor and against those types of reforms. And it's a very robust, sort of lively debates that happen at the conference. And that one, we just had it in January. We are hoping to be able to travel. So we won't meet virtually next year. We're hoping we'll actually have it in Dublin next year. So that would be very, very hopeful that happens. That would be excellent.
I love it. And for our listeners, all of the references that Dr. Egalite just shared with us, I will hyperlink on our show notes so you can click right on those and find those. And so you mentioned this report, and I really want to dig into it because pulling together 2 decades of research and helping those, particularly from my perspective, practitioners really get deep into what matters most. And having a report like this is so very important. And so as it was released, I was just so very excited. The title of the report, How Principles Affect Students and Schools, a systemic synthesis of 2 decades of research. And so part of the report, you were sharing the characteristics of principals and how they've changed over time. What did you see and what did your research reveal to you?
Yeah, that was a really interesting question to use national data so that we could speak to all public school principals, and that's both in the traditional public and charter public schools. And so what we were interested in was how their characteristics have changed, and there's three key things that stood out. The first is that principals are becoming more female. At the beginning of this time period in the 80s, it was about 22% of principals were female, but today it's closer to 50. It's more of a 50-50 split. Yeah. Another trend is to do with experience. The average principal has less experience now than they did at the beginning of this time period. And if you break it out by school need, and so we group the schools by the percentage of students that qualify for free and reduced lunch. And so the highest need schools actually have principals with the lowest experience levels. So there's lots to think about with that. And then the third trend that stands out over this time period is that principals have become more racially and ethnically diverse. And that's a great thing to see. But when you map it against the changes in the student body, there's just no comparison. They have not kept up with the changes among students. So there continues to be this very significant representation gap.
You made me smile when you shared that in terms of gender, we had moved towards 50-50, which I think is incredible. You made me frown as you shared that the experience of our principals, the years of experience, is certainly going down. And then I guess I was somewhat neutral. As you said, we are becoming more diverse, but we're not keeping up with the diversity of the student body. And so there's things to celebrate there and things to continue to work on. The experience thing is something that I've talked with my colleagues about because it seems like as education continues to be a tough profession. It is a very tough profession. That's not news to any of our listeners, our ed leaders around the world. But it seems like we're not having as many individuals come into the education profession. And those who are close to retirement are taking advantage of that opportunity, or they're choosing to do other work outside of the school classroom or the school building. And so what's interesting to me is that ed leaders who in the past may not have been considered for a principalship because of their lack of years of experience now are rising to the top because that candidate pool is so shallow. And so in some ways, I'm not surprised by what you found there in terms of the characteristics of the principals, but there is that piece to celebrate in terms of we're about 50-50 male to female. And I do celebrate that and certainly look forward to continuing our work around diversifying our leaders, particularly our principals. And in the work, you also looked at what effective leaders look like in terms of skills and behaviors. What did you and your colleagues find there in terms of across the research?
Yeah, so there's this really famous report that gets cited in our circles all the time that says leadership is second only to classroom instruction among all school-related factors that contribute to what students learn at school. And so that was the Leithwood et al. Original report that the foundation had commissioned. It came out in 2004. And our main goal with this synthesis was to update that and to quantify it a little bit better and say, okay, it's second to classroom instruction, but how large is it? Put a number on it. Tell us in months of learning. What do students benefit? What do they see in terms of gains when it comes to having an effective principal? So we had two main goals with the work. The first was to quantify the principal's impact. And the second, as you just alluded to, was to categorize what are the skills and behaviors of really effective principals. And if I could just speak a little bit about the process of how we came up with this. We did this systematic search through all of the scholarly databases at our disposal through various libraries at Vanderbilt and UNC Chapel Hill and NC State. And then we supplement it with review of what they call the gray literature, things like think tank reports and research firms. So we did a very thorough search for everything that had been written on the topic since 2000. We picked that as our starting year. And so what we uncovered was almost 5,000 studies. It was 4,832, which we had to go through and screen to find which are relevant to answering these two questions. So we processed all those and went through these like a funnel, various screening levels, and got it down to 219. And so the report that we released this month is based on a very thorough reading and full text coding of 219 ed leadership studies. And the first main conclusion that we come up with from having processed all of this rich information is that there is very strong evidence that having an effective principal contributes substantially to student achievement. And if we were to quantify it, I can tell you in sort of nerdy researcher language, or I can translate it to months of learning, but I'll do both. We find 6 really high quality studies that use these very up-to-date panel data methods that can track a principle over time and account for any sources of bias that might influence the impact estimate. And so we can tease out, well, what is the narrow part that's just attributed to the principle's effect? And the benefit of increasing principal effectiveness by a standard deviation is about 13% of a standard deviation in math achievement for students and 9% in reading. But let me just translate that. It's about 3 months of additional learning. So replacing a below average school principal with an above average school principal, the average student will see a gain of about 3 months of learning in both math and reading.
Incredible.
And these effects are large. If we put them in context of other educational interventions or the effect of having a strong teacher, for example, they're very large in magnitude. And the also thing to keep in mind is that they're student level effects. And so they're felt by every student in the school. For the average elementary student, that's about 483 students in each school that is feeling this benefit. And it's not just benefits on test scores. We've looked at what the literature has to say about other outcomes, and we find positive impacts of principles on absenteeism, teacher reports of their working conditions, teacher job satisfaction, and teacher turnover. One of the conclusions of the report, I'll quote it to you, is it's difficult to envision an investment with a higher ceiling on its potential return than a successful effort to improve principal leadership.
I'm just sitting here just smiling because I recognize anecdotally and through experience just how powerful and important a principle is. And I have also quoted quite widely the initial report that leadership was second only to classroom instruction. And so to be able to quantify that becomes really important to advocate for the role of principal, whether that's policy work or work politically to improve salaries or working conditions for principals, et cetera, but also to amplify the work, to talk about how very important it is to have a quality principal in every single building, because as your research has shown, it makes a difference at the student level. And I've felt that. I think ed leaders know that in their hearts to be true, but to actually be able to point to a highly regarded research study like this through the Wallace Foundation that you've helped to author is just absolutely wonderful. And so I just want to thank you for being willing to do that work. Now, I have to ask you a bit of a silly question, but one that came to mind right away. How in the world and how long does it take to go through 5,000 pieces of research to narrow it down to 219? Pull back the curtain for just a little bit. What does that look like?
Let's just say we've been working on it for a few years with many research assistants.
Oh my goodness. You said those numbers and I was thinking back to my own doctoral work and I was thinking, good gracious, I can't imagine going through that, but I'm so grateful that you absolutely did. And so thank you for doing that work. It's so very important and I do appreciate it. And of course, it does push our need to really think about professional development for principals to help grow principals, and stepping back from that, professional development for assistant principals and really being thoughtful around how we're helping assistant principals grow in their practice so they're ready to step in and make this incredible difference.
It's funny you should say that, because one of the other reports I mentioned, there were 3 companion reports funded at the same time. The second one that will come out in a couple of months is focused on the assistant principal. And they asked the question, is this an endpoint for some? And it appears to be that they're training to be an assistant principal and they don't have plans to assume the principalship, whereas for others, it's a stepping stone along the way. And so they're asking, I think, what are really intriguing questions, which is, how should we be thinking about this role? Is it a stepping stone? Is it an endpoint? And what are the best ways to prepare somebody to be successful in that role?
That research will be very fascinating. I spent almost 11 years as an elementary and most of the time as a high school principal and worked with absolutely phenomenal assistant principals. Most were aspiring to the principalship and working hard for that. A couple did not have that desire, but were incredibly effective as an assistant principal. And so that's a tough question. With the difficulty in finding principals, then certainly we see the assistant principalship as a pipeline to the principalship and want to honor that. We need that, but I don't want to, as a superintendent, I don't want to lose the opportunity for those who may be outstanding assistant principals, but may not aspire to the principalship, for them to not have that opportunity to serve. That's such a powerful question. I can't wait for that report to come out again as a companion report to the one that has just been released that you helped to author. So while I have this opportunity, this incredible opportunity to chat with you, I know that one of the big areas for you in terms of research interest is around school choice. And so I just wonder, from kind of a broad view, particularly for those who may work in traditional public education, what message would you have for those who are doing that work, particularly as we think about school choice and its prevalence and its growing prevalence in our country and really probably around the world? Just your thoughts around this big area of research for you.
I think it's really important to be clear about our role as the researcher. I'm not an advocate. I'm not a policymaker. I'm not a politician. And so I don't have the luxury of having an opinion on this. And that's what I train my graduate students to think also, that our goal is to answer the question objectively with all of the data presented fairly and transparently, and that informs the conversations for those who want to have debates around it. There are some questions that are testable hypotheses. Do students learn more or less? Does attendance go up or down? Are there spillover effects on students who are left behind? That's a topic we're currently looking at in North Carolina. What people want to do with those answers is a separate question from our role in all of this. So we're trying to generate the data and the numbers to provide knowledge for the state, so that then the best decisions can be made moving forwards, and people can debate over the values, the value propositions, or the questions at the heart of all of these reforms. But that's not our role to do. Our role is to do the research, and that's what we strive to do, is to do it as objectively as possible.
I love that you very clearly and very quickly said, now, wait a minute, we're not here to influence, because you're exactly right. The role is to have good data for the decision makers to make. In terms of good data, and maybe not just here in our state, but perhaps in the United States or around the world, is school choice, is it growing substantially? Is there a leveling of the growth of other opportunities outside of public education? Just in general, what is the data showing you in terms of the prevalence of school choice or other opportunities for education for parents?
Yeah, and it's a big window, a big umbrella, because there's public school choice too. There's open enrollment, there's magnet programs, there's within district and between district choice. And so as a whole, I think we are moving towards greater choice overall. There's other forms of choice that allow people to move from public to private. And that sector, although it is growing, it's still less than 1% of all students in the entire country are exercising that type of choice through a state-funded program. There are others who self-finance a private education. That's always been a consistent feature of American education, that there are families who can and do pay for an alternative education. And then what I think will be really interesting to track with the pandemic and the fallout from that and how we adapt moving forward is the number of families who opt to homeschool, and this idea of hybrid homeschooling, where they're maybe enrolled in some virtual courses or using funds to pay for tutors in particular subjects, or for students with special educational needs who might buy therapies in more of a piecemeal fashion. And so I think it's going to be fascinating to just see what happens and have good data to track it and understand what those patterns are.
I tell you, well, thank you very much for sharing that. One of the things that I certainly am hopeful of in terms of school choice is that it pushes every single school and school system to get better, to really be thoughtful about our practice, to ensure we're doing all we can for our children, because they're certainly worthy of our every effort. Dr. Egalite, what an absolute blessing to have the opportunity to spend time with you. I want to again congratulate you on being one of the top 200 scholars. I understand that actually comes from a pool of over 20,000. So to be in the top 200 out of 20,000, absolutely remarkable. 2 years in a row. I'm just so proud as a North Carolinian and as an educator of that ranking for you. And we're looking forward to the three-peat. And when that happens, we'll have to have you back on EdLeader so we can celebrate with you. Thank you so much.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for all your hard work with this podcast. It's such a great gift to the community.
Thank you, my friend.
I hope that you enjoyed our time today with Dr. Egalite. I was particularly pleased when she said just what we expected. There is strong evidence that having an effective principal contributes substantially to student achievement. There's no question that principals and ed leaders make a difference. Speaking of making a difference, thank you for spending time with me today, and thank you for all that you do for every student, every teacher, and every staff member. You are making a difference. If no one else has told you, I want you to know that I believe in you. Good day.
Thank you for listening to the EdLeader podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast and consider leaving a review with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts so that we may continue to grow the EdLeader community. We hope that you have enjoyed your time with Dr. Jackson. Until next time.